My sisters watched me sacrifice my life as their sick mother's servant, then laughed, calling me family maid, but they went pale when the lawyer read Mom's secret will. I was elbow deep in my mother's laundry when my sister called me the family maid for the first time. Not quietly. Not as a whisper between her and Sandra in the hallway. She said it loudly, clearly, with the kind of confidence that comes from someone who has never once been inconvenienced by another person's suffering. "That's what she's here for," Diane said to her husband on the phone, not even bothering to lower her voice. "She's basically Mom's maid at this point." And I stood there in the laundry room holding a pile of sheets I had just stripped from my mother's bed at 2 in the morning, and I said nothing. I folded the sheets. I started the wash. I told myself it did not matter what Diane called me because I knew what I was doing and why I was doing it. I was wrong about how little it mattered. And I was completely wrong about what my mother was quietly doing while I said nothing. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what happened, because the person I was before all of this is important. My name is Rachel. I am the middle daughter of 3. Diane is the oldest, 51, married to a man named Paul who has never changed a diaper or cooked a meal in his life and considers himself a great provider because he pays for things. Sandra is the youngest, 44, lives 40 minutes away, has 2 teenagers and a gym membership she treats like a second religion. I am 47. I am divorced. I have no children. And when our mother, Eleanor, was diagnosed with stage 3 kidney disease 4 years ago, I was the one who moved back into the house. Nobody asked me directly. That is the part people do not understand when I try to explain how this happened. There was no family meeting where someone said, "Rachel, we need you to do this." There was a diagnosis, and then there was a silence, and in that silence I looked at my own life, my small apartment, my freelance accounting work that I could do from anywhere, my empty calendar on weekends, and I made a decision that I told myself was a choice. It took me 2 years to understand it was not entirely a choice. It was the path of least resistance for 2 women who had already decided, without saying so out loud, that this was going to be my responsibility. The first 6 months were manageable. Mom was still mostly independent. I drove her to appointments, managed her medications, made sure she was eating properly and following her fluid restrictions. Diane called every Sunday. Sandra visited once a month, always on a Saturday, always for exactly 3 hours, always leaving with the specific energy of someone who has fulfilled an obligation and can now return to their real life without guilt. I noticed the pattern immediately. I said nothing about it for almost a year. By month 8, Mom needed more help. The disease was progressing faster than the doctors had initially projected. She was tired constantly. Some days she could not get out of bed without assistance. I was waking up twice a night to check on her. I was managing her dialysis schedule, coordinating with her medical team, handling her insurance paperwork, doing the grocery shopping, the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, the garden she loved and could no longer tend herself. I was also still trying to maintain my accounting clients because I still needed to eat and pay my portion of the household expenses. I called Diane in month 9. I told her I needed help. I was specific. I told her I needed one of them to come stay for a week so I could sleep through the night and catch up on work. Diane told me she wished she could, but Paul's schedule was impossible and the kids, her kids who were 19 and 22 and completely capable of caring for themselves, needed her. I called Sandra the same day. Sandra told me she understood how hard it was and that she was going to try to come more often. She came 3 weeks later for 4 hours on a Saturday and brought a casserole that Mom could not eat because of her dietary restrictions. I stopped calling them to ask for help after that. Not because I stopped needing it. Because I understood something that took me too long to name clearly: they were never going to give it. They had assessed the situation and concluded that I was handling it and therefore it did not require their involvement. The fact that I was handling it while slowly disappearing as a person, while my social life contracted to nothing, while my sleep became fragmented and my work suffered and my own health checkups went unscheduled for 2 years, was not information they were interested in receiving. Mom noticed. That is the thing I did not fully understand until much later. I thought she was too ill, too tired, too focused on her own survival to see what was happening between her daughters. I was wrong. Eleanor had been watching people her entire life. She had raised 3 daughters and she knew exactly who each of us was. She saw Diane's Sunday calls for what they were: maintenance calls designed to produce the feeling of involvement without the cost of it. She saw Sandra's monthly visits as performances. And she saw me, actually saw me, in a way I had stopped expecting from anyone. She told me once, about 18 months in, on a night when I had helped her back to bed after a difficult few hours and was sitting with her while she settled, that she did not know how to thank me for what I was doing. I told her she did not need to thank me. She looked at me with the specific expression that mothers have when they are about to say something true and important. She said, "I see you, Rachel. I see all 3 of you. And I want you to know that I see the difference. I did not ask her what she meant by that. I was too tired. And some part of me was afraid that if I opened that door, I would say things I could not take back about her other daughters. So I tucked her in and went back to my room and stared at the ceiling and thought about the last time anyone had told me they saw me. The comment that finally broke something open happened at Christmas. Diane and Sandra both came, which was itself unusual, and they brought their families, and for approximately 4 hours the house was full and loud and festive in a way that felt almost normal. I had spent 3 days preparing. The food, the decorations, the gifts I had wrapped for everyone, the specific dietary accommodations for Mom's restrictions, all of it organized and executed by me while Diane and Sandra arrived with wine and the particular ease of people who are guests in a house they grew up in. At some point in the afternoon I was in the kitchen finishing the dishes, because I was always finishing the dishes, and I heard Diane in the living room telling her husband a story. The story was about Mom's care. She was describing the situation to Paul's parents, who had apparently asked how Eleanor was managing. And Diane said, with warmth, with what sounded almost like affection, "Oh, Rachel handles all of that. She's basically taken over completely. She's like Mom's personal maid at this point." Laughter. Actual laughter from the room. And then the conversation moved on. I stood at the sink and I felt something shift inside me. Not break. Shift. The way tectonic plates shift before an earthquake. Quiet and foundational and promising something catastrophic later. I did not confront Diane that day. I served the Christmas dinner. I cleaned up afterward. I made sure Mom took her evening medication. I said goodbye to everyone with a smile that I constructed carefully and maintained for the 3 hours it took everyone to leave. And then I sat in the quiet house with my mother sleeping down the hall and I let myself feel, for the first time without managing it, how completely I had been erased by the people who were supposed to be my family. Mom got significantly worse in year 3. The dialysis was no longer managing her levels effectively. The doctors began having careful conversations about what the next phase of her care would require. I attended every one of those conversations. Diane attended one, via speakerphone, for 40 minutes before she had to take another call. Sandra came to 2 in person but sat in the corner looking at her phone and asked no questions. The medical decisions fell to me by default. Not because anyone formally designated me as Mom's primary caregiver or medical decision maker. Because I was the one who was there. Because I had the information. Because when the doctors needed someone to call, they called my number because it was the number that got answered. Mom updated her legal documents in year 3. I did not know the specifics of what she changed. She told me she had met with her attorney and that everything was in order, and she asked me not to mention it to my sisters because she did not want any discussions about it while she was still alive. She was very clear about that. She said, "I have made my decisions and I am at peace with them and I do not want the last period of my life to be about arguments over things that will be settled when I'm gone." I respected that. I asked no questions. I focused on making whatever time she had left as comfortable as possible. She passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, 14 months ago. She was in her own bed, in her own home, which is what she had wanted. I was holding her hand. Diane was in Phoenix at a work conference she had decided not to cancel because the doctors had said Mom had weeks, not days, and Diane had decided that meant she had time. Sandra was 40 minutes away and did not make it in time despite leaving immediately when I called. I handled the arrangements. I notified the family. I received the condolences. I wrote the obituary. I coordinated with the funeral home. I responded to every card and message. I did all of it while Diane and Sandra arrived 2 days later and moved through the house with the specific grief of people who are mourning someone they loved but did not show up for, which is a complicated and guilty grief that can sometimes express itself as entitlement. Diane went through Mom's jewelry the first evening. Not aggressively. Just casually, with the assumption of someone who expects to find what she is looking for. Sandra made comments about certain pieces of furniture she had always loved. I said nothing. I was too tired to navigate the undercurrent of what was already beginning. The attorney called 2 weeks after the funeral. He scheduled a meeting to read the will. All 3 of us attended, in his office, on a Wednesday afternoon. Diane wore a blazer. Sandra had come straight from the gym and was still in her workout clothes, which I noticed and said nothing about. I wore the same black dress I had worn to the funeral because it was still clean and I had not had the energy to think about clothing. The attorney, a calm and measured man named Mr. Hargrove, opened the meeting with standard language about the purpose of the gathering. He explained that Eleanor had updated her will approximately 18 months before her passing and that she had been of sound mind and had worked with his office over several sessions to ensure her wishes were documented clearly. He looked at all 3 of us with the specific expression of a professional who knows he is about to change the temperature in the room and has made peace with that fact. He began reading. The house went to me. Fully. No shared ownership, no buyout arrangement, no divided estate. The house, which had been appraised at significant value given the neighborhood, was mine outright. The investment accounts, which none of us had known the full extent of, were divided with 60% designated for me and 20% each for Diane and Sandra. The jewelry, which Diane had already begun mentally cataloging, had been individually designated. Certain pieces to me. Certain pieces to specific grandchildren. 2 pieces to Diane. 1 to Sandra. There was a letter. Mr. Hargrove indicated that Eleanor had asked him to read it aloud if all 3 daughters were present, which we were. He unfolded it. He began reading in the same measured tone he had used for the legal language, and I watched my sisters' faces as our mother's words entered the room. The letter was not cruel. I want to be clear about that because Eleanor was not a cruel woman. But it was honest in the way that people become honest when they know they are writing their final true document. She wrote that she loved all 3 of her daughters. She wrote that she understood each of them. She wrote that the decisions she had made in her will were not punishments but reflections of what she had witnessed over 4 years of needing care. She wrote that she had watched one daughter move into her home and give up pieces of her own life, quietly and without complaint, to ensure that her mother's final years were spent in dignity and comfort. She wrote that she had watched this daughter be called a maid by her own sisters and say nothing. She wrote that she had heard that word and she had not forgotten it. She wrote that love is demonstrated in presence. In sacrifice. In the quiet Tuesday morning when everyone else is elsewhere and one person is holding your hand. Diane's face went pale somewhere in the second paragraph of the letter. Not flushed. Pale. The color draining in a way that happens when understanding arrives faster than a person is prepared to receive it. Sandra looked at the floor. She did not look up for a long time. Mr. Hargrove finished reading. He folded the letter. He placed it on the desk in front of me and said it was mine to keep. The room was completely silent. Diane looked at me. And for the first time in 4 years, possibly longer, she had no words. The silence in Mr. Hargrove's office lasted approximately 45 seconds. I counted because I needed something to focus on that was not my sisters' faces. 45 seconds of the kind of quiet that follows a revelation that cannot be undone, the specific silence of people realizing that a story they thought they understood has just been rewritten from the final page backward. Diane broke it. Of course Diane broke it. She did not yell. Diane has never been a person who yells because yelling requires losing control, and Diane has spent her entire life maintaining the appearance of control. What she did was lean forward in her chair and use the voice she reserves for situations where she believes she is being wronged, a voice that is calm and measured on the surface and absolutely furious underneath. She said, "This is not what Mom would have wanted." I looked at her. I said nothing. She continued. She said that Mom had clearly been influenced. That 18 months ago Mom had been ill and possibly not thinking clearly, and that a decision of this magnitude, made while she was in declining health, was exactly the kind of decision that could be challenged. She looked at Mr. Hargrove when she said the word challenged, and Mr. Hargrove looked back at her with the expression of a man who has seen this moment many times and has his response ready. He explained, calmly and thoroughly, that Eleanor had met with his office on 4 separate occasions over a period of 3 months to discuss and finalize her wishes. That she had been assessed for cognitive clarity at each visit. That she had brought her own notes. That she had asked questions, revised language, and demonstrated throughout the process a precise and deliberate understanding of what she was doing and why. He said that Eleanor had specifically anticipated the possibility that her decisions might be questioned, and had taken steps to ensure the documentation was thorough enough to withstand any challenge. He said the word challenge the way lawyers say it when they want you to understand that the challenge would be expensive, lengthy, and unsuccessful. Diane sat back. Sandra still had not looked up from the floor. I picked up the letter. I folded it carefully. I put it in my bag. I thanked Mr. Hargrove for his time. I stood up. And I left the office without speaking to either of my sisters. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 22 minutes. I did not cry. I am not entirely sure what I did. I think I simply existed in the space between the life I had been living and whatever came next, feeling the specific weight of 4 years settled differently now that I understood my mother had seen every day of them. Diane called that evening. I did not answer. She called 3 more times before sending a text that said she thought we needed to talk about this as a family and that she hoped I understood this was not personal. I read the text. I put the phone face down on the counter. I made myself dinner for the first time in 4 years without calculating anyone else's dietary restrictions, and I sat at the kitchen table in the house that was now mine and ate it in complete silence. Sandra called 2 days later. Her approach was different from Diane's because Sandra has always been the sister who leads with emotion rather than strategy. She was crying when I answered, which I did because some part of me was curious what she would say. She told me she was sorry. She said she knew she had not been there the way she should have been. She said she loved Mom and she loved me and she hoped we could find a way through this. I listened to all of it. And then I asked her one question. I asked her if she remembered Christmas, 3 years ago, when Diane called me the family maid in front of Paul's parents and the room laughed. The silence on Sandra's end was its own answer. I told her I needed time. I ended the call. The weeks that followed were strange in a way I had not anticipated. I had spent 4 years in a state of constant motion, constant management, constant awareness of another person's needs and schedules and medications and comfort. And now there was stillness. The house was quiet in a way it had not been since before Mom got sick, and the quiet was both relief and grief simultaneously, because the person whose presence had filled the house was gone, and the reason the house was now mine was the same reason she was gone. I went through her things slowly. Not efficiently, the way Diane would have done it, not reluctantly, the way Sandra would have done it, but slowly, the way you go through the belongings of someone you loved and cared for and knew in the particular intimate way that only comes from being present for someone's most vulnerable moments. I found things I had not known about her. Letters she had kept. Photographs from before we were born. A journal she had kept sporadically for decades that I read with the specific feeling of encountering a person more fully after they are gone than you were able to while they were alive. She had written about me. Not constantly. But in the entries from the last 2 years there were references to what she called Rachel's quiet endurance. She wrote once that she worried about me. That she worried I had learned, somewhere along the way, to make myself small enough to fit whatever space was left after everyone else had taken what they needed. She wrote that she hoped whatever she could leave me would be enough to let me take up space again. I held that journal for a long time after I read that entry. Diane retained a lawyer. I found out through a letter that arrived about 6 weeks after the will reading, formal and careful, outlining her intention to contest certain aspects of the estate on the grounds that the distribution was inequitable and potentially the result of undue influence. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, a woman named Patricia who had been recommended by a colleague, and Patricia read it and told me what Mr. Hargrove had essentially already told Diane in that office. The documentation was thorough, the process had been careful, and a contest would be difficult and costly. I did not feel anger when I read Diane's legal letter. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a story like this to involve anger, and there was certainly anger somewhere in the previous 4 years, anger I had managed and suppressed and converted into productivity because feeling it fully while also caring for a dying parent was not something I had the capacity to do. But in that moment, reading the letter, what I felt was something quieter and sadder than anger. I felt the specific grief of understanding that my sister's response to our mother's final statement about who had shown up was to hire someone to argue that the statement should not count. The legal challenge went nowhere. Patricia handled it efficiently. Diane dropped it after 2 months when her own attorney apparently gave her the same assessment Mr. Hargrove had given her in the office. The withdrawal came through in a letter that was brief and contained no acknowledgement of anything that had happened. Just legal language indicating that the challenge was being withdrawn. I filed it. I moved on. Sandra did not join Diane's legal challenge. I found that out later, through the kind of information that moves through families whether you want it to or not. Sandra had apparently told Diane that she did not think contesting the will was right. That Mom had made her wishes clear. That they needed to accept it. Diane had, according to the account that reached me, not responded well to this. There had been a significant argument between them that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the accumulated weight of 2 people who had avoided accountability for years suddenly having nowhere left to redirect it. I did not reach out to Sandra after I heard about this. I was not ready. The sorry she had offered on the phone was real, I believe that, but sorry and changed are different things, and I needed time to understand what, if anything, I wanted from a relationship with either of my sisters going forward. The house required work. 4 years of focused care for a sick person means that maintenance gets deferred, projects get postponed, things that need attention get added to a list that never gets shorter. I started working through that list slowly, hiring contractors for what I could not do myself, doing what I could with my own hands on weekends. There was something grounding about it. About the physical reality of fixing things. About the visible evidence of effort resulting in visible improvement, which is not always how life works but is reliably how houses work. My accounting clients had suffered during the caregiving years. Not catastrophically, but enough. I had let some relationships lapse. I had been slower to pursue new work. I spent several months rebuilding, reaching out to former clients, taking on new projects, being honest with people I trusted about why I had been less present professionally and what I was doing to correct it. Most people were understanding. A few had moved on. I rebuilt what I could and accepted what was gone. I started sleeping through the night somewhere around month 3 after Mom passed. Not every night. But regularly enough that I stopped tracking it, which is its own kind of milestone. I had not slept through the night reliably in almost 3 years. The exhaustion I had been carrying had become so normalized that I had forgotten what its absence felt like. When it began to lift, slowly, unevenly, I understood for the first time how much of myself I had lost to it and how long the process of recovering would actually take. I thought about Mom constantly in those months. Not with the acute grief of the early weeks, but with the quieter, more permanent grief that settles in when someone is simply gone from the world and you are still in it without them. I thought about her watching. About the 4 years of observation she had conducted from her bed, from her chair, from her place at the kitchen table where I brought her meals, and she watched me with eyes that I now understood were taking careful note of everything. She had seen me be called a maid in my own family and say nothing. She had seen me absorb that without complaint, absorb years of it, and keep going. And she had, in the one document she had complete control over, said loudly and clearly and permanently what she thought of what she had seen. I have thought often about whether I would have wanted her to say something while she was alive. To confront Diane. To demand more from Sandra. To name what was happening. And the honest answer is that I am not sure. Because the letter she left was, in its own way, more powerful than any conversation could have been. It was evidence that could not be reinterpreted or argued away or softened after the fact. It existed in legal language in a formal document witnessed by professionals. It was my mother's final, unambiguous truth, and no one in that office could pretend they had not heard it. Diane and I have not spoken since the parking garage. Not directly. Not personally. There have been logistics, things related to the estate that required communication, and those have gone through attorneys or through brief and practical emails. She has not apologized. I do not expect her to. Apology would require a degree of self-examination that I have watched Diane avoid for 50 years, and I do not believe she is going to locate it now. Sandra and I have spoken twice more. The conversations have been careful and honest in a way our conversations were not before any of this happened. She told me, in the second call, that she had been thinking about Christmas, about the maid comment, about the fact that she had been in the room and had laughed along and had never said anything to me about it or to Diane. She said she did not have a good explanation for why. I told her I appreciated her saying it. I did not tell her it was okay because it was not okay, and she did not ask me to say it was. We are in a place that I would describe as careful and early. Something that might become something. I am not rushing it. The house is mine. I am in it. I wake up in the morning in the house where I was raised and where I spent 4 years caring for the woman who raised me, and I make coffee and I sit at the kitchen table, and I think about what it means to show up for someone. To be present when presence is inconvenient. To do the Tuesday morning things and the 2 in the morning things and the 3 days before Christmas things that no one else is going to do. I think about how invisible that kind of love can be. How easy it is to look at someone who is holding everything together and assume they are fine, that they do not need anything, that the fact that they are managing means they do not require support. I think about how I participated in my own erasure by never demanding to be seen. By managing instead of speaking. By folding the sheets and starting the wash and going back to bed and telling myself it did not matter. It mattered. My mother knew it mattered. And in the one place where her voice was final and unambiguous, she said so. I still have the letter. It is in the drawer of the table by my bed. Some nights I take it out and I read it again, not because I need to, but because there is something I am still learning from it about what it means to be witnessed. To have someone see your sacrifice not as a given, not as a character trait that makes you useful, but as a choice that cost you something real and deserved to be honored. She called me the family maid. My mother called me the daughter who showed up. Only one of those women had to live in that house and know the truth. And in the end, only one of them got to decide what it was worth. If you are reading this because you are the one who shows up, the one who manages, the one who absorbs without complaint while others take and minimize and laugh and move on, I want you to understand something that took me 4 years of silence to learn. Being seen is not the same as being thanked. Being honored is not the same as being comfortable. And sometimes the people who witness your sacrifice most clearly are not the ones making noise about it. They are the ones watching quietly from the chair by the window, taking careful note of everything, waiting for the one moment where their voice will be final. Show up anyway. Not because you will be rewarded, but because the person in the chair sees you. And that is worth more than anyone in the room who is laughing will ever understand.